If you've already listened to our human-centered design episode from September, you'll remember we ended on a note about chickens. Well, this bonus clip isn't exactly about poultry, thankfully for you, though there is plenty of human behavior to peck at. Am I sorry for that bad joke? Never. What you're about to hear in this Design Build Delivers podcast content episode is a little bit deeper look into the messier side of designing for people. Things like satisfaction surveys, public art, and that ever-touchy question of what's considered offensive. It's thoughtful, a little granular, and occasionally uncomfortable, but in the best possible way. At DBIA, we don't take sides on these issues and conversations, but we do bring in people who have extraordinary expertise in navigating these complicated places like human behavior. Sometimes doing what's right for people means first admitting people are completely complicated. This is the Design Build Delivers podcast, brought to you by ARKANCE as always. Now, let's get back to our conversation with Deb Sheehan and Susan O'Connell, who know good design starts with great listening and sometimes a healthy tolerance for chaos. Let's talk now about this idea of design justice that you've mentioned.
I think the idea is that for a very long time, we have segregated society, we have segregated buildings all the way back to separate accommodations for different kind of people. So design justice to me is a little bit of going overboard, taking another step and another step to make sure that you're being inclusive and understanding what people want and need and how they're going to flow through the space and all the different types of space. So when we were programming our state office building for DGS, we were asking them all the normal questions. But if you think about a public building, the second graders come and the seventh graders come and the 11th graders come, and they're all doing different things. So I think it's about overthinking a little bit who's going to be there, asking the right questions to make sure that no one is excluded or feels excluded. And then it's about access too. In classroom buildings, let's say where we have a lot of faculty offices, the faculty used to always tell us they want to be on the top floor in the corner by themselves. And we'd say, but you have office hours and students are coming to see you and, you need to be accessible. So in much more recent projects, they're in little huddle spaces together on every floor near a stair and an elevator. And there's space outside, like stand-up counters for students to open up a laptop, show each other something while they're waiting. There's no more ivory towers. And it's all about accessibility because everyone's paying the same tuition. Everyone in California is paying taxes and they all might want to go see their council person, etc. That's how we are practicing and seeing design justice in our work.
Here's a follow-up to that. As you were talking, I was thinking about, I'm not sure if you guys watched Parks and Recreation when it was on or even now. They work for the Parks and Rec department in Pawnee, Indiana, and they have this mural of the history of Pawnee, and it is deeply offensive. And I wonder, I may be off base, but I'm just curious, how does the aesthetic come into design justice? Artwork that you display, any of the community elements you might bring in?
I think it can be because normally there's a really public process about the public art, and it happens very slowly. So this is funny, but Deb, we get our design build projects, whether best value or progressive, done in like under 3 years, typically, right? $50 to $200 million building, but it might take the artwork 3.5 years to get in. It might take them an entire semester to pick the committee that's doing it because they are including everyone on campus and they're including different viewpoints, and they tend to pick artists and craftsmen from the neighborhood that have some kind of social significance. And I think when you show artwork that is, quote, offensive, but you show it in this historical context of this is how it used to be, and you can kind of see how it's evolved. Yeah, I think we have a little bit going on right now where people are trying to change the messages in our museums, right? What happened is what happened, and being able to look back, understand it, and see that we've moved forward, I think is really important. So it's the context that you see the art in, and I think the art comes from the community the building is sitting in, typically.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Context does count, does play into this. But what's funny about Pawnee being, a total send up, being a complete parody, worst case scenario, is that there's no way even historical context could defend this mural they have right there in City Hall that is, I shouldn't even laugh, but it's the worst possible depiction you could have. It's the colonization of the area. It is the massacre by the white settlers of the Wamapoke, the indigenous people of the area, and everyone in the building is embarrassed of it. Everyone who comes by is embarrassed of it, and it's all part of the problematic history of local government in Pawnee. And of course, it is a joke and a worst case scenario to sort of illustrate what you're talking about. I used to work at an HBCU that did what you're suggesting here really well, actually. They would choose artwork, they would choose exhibitions that did what you're saying, which is ask people to question, to recognize, and to say, this is part of this community, and this is part of the history of the people who are coming through here today. So that's why I was asking about the artwork and where that plays into this concept of design justice.
Well, and I think art in the installations that I've seen them be most successful always create and give a building a sense of place. And in healthcare settings, for sure, we want to make certain that people feel welcomed, that they recognize it, that it's something that they feel comfortable enough to be authentic, because they're often at their most vulnerable. And so we really want people to, again, feel safe, secure, but it has to be something that is, yes, welcoming, but often the message in the artwork is there is a distinct sense of place about the community in which that healthcare is being served and delivered. And I think it's super critical in conversations today as we look to balance very precious resources and capital development with, a lot of need that quite frankly is outpacing the resources available. When we start to think about that balancing act, it's always not lost on me that as a healthcare consumer myself, my high deductible health plan, I'm paying more of my share these days than I used to, right? We all are. It's just the nature of what has happened in insurance. And it's fascinating to me how my lens has shifted. When I enter a building, I don't want to see gilded lilies. I don't want to see overdone finishes, because then I start to question, what are you really valuing and what are you spending your money on? And I think the same speaks to the artwork. It has to give me a sense of ownership of place. It should be something, hopefully, that gives me a sense of calm and confidence. But I don't need stuff that's over the top, because we all are starting to, again, that context question, I'm looking at it through a different lens because I'm sensitized to different value sets now, right? Where it was different when I didn't see the exposure of all the costs with healthcare. Now I'm seeing and feeling that much more notably in my own personal finance.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I want to double down on the word, authentic, that every university and civic clients want something that is authentically of the place where they are, of their university, their values, their students, the way they teach. And so I think that in the same way, buildings on campuses aren't these ivory towers that are very expensive. They're accessible, they're open. The art is more modern, maybe with some kind of affirmative message or something that is kind of uplifting, but it's not too daunting, because if it's too daunting, the students aren't going to come in. They're not going to feel comfortable. And we make an awful lot of the environmental graphics in our buildings changeable over time. We don't assume the first time we put graphics up in a building, they probably have like a 6 or 7 year shelf life, but they're designed that way. And they're on certain walls that it's easy to change and it's understood. Whereas we used to carve in stone like that, that painting of the massacre that you were just discussing. There's a place for all of that so we don't forget our history, right?
Some history is a little easier to move on from,
from.
especially if you can't change it. So recent industry reporting from Build News specifically shows human-centered design can boost user satisfaction by up to 40%. It can reduce post-occupancy changes by 25%. So how does that align or not align with your own project experiences?
I think Deb's condition is going to be very different. But if we're getting people from the thought of the building to moving into the building, with these early studies, 3.5, 4 years, it means that the group of people who helped you design it and answer the questions are likely to be populating it, not everyone. But we find that things change so quickly at universities, more so at universities than civic and government, that the next person will come in who is the leader of, residential education for freshmen or something, and they will have different ideas. But in general, because it's such a fast process and they can see the power of their decisions, I do think there's an awful lot of owner satisfaction in seeing it happen so quickly and knowing that what they said was heard. And, oh, that's how that room morphed when I gave this comment about XYZ. Or I love the way the outdoor amphitheater turned out because we put a slate chalkboard, for the outdoor classroom. People inherently are going to buy into the design if they're part of it. And then if they see their mark in the building somewhere and how it's being used, I think it brings this level of ownership, and that ownership makes them feel like they've been heard and they like their space. But no architect has ever walked through a building that someone didn't immediately talk about, well, we wish we had an outlet there. Everyone wants more power and more data wherever they go, right?
Always. Yeah. Susan, your comment about letting them see their contribution, I think is really important, because what we have found is sometimes you're doing change management through a build process, right? I always say in healthcare, there's some of the best workforce that has conditioned themselves to workarounds because they're working in antiquated real estate that was built back in the late 60s and early 70s. So they've gotten conditioned to know how to do things. And all of a sudden you change the landscape on them and they're like, whoa, wait a minute, you're asking me to do what? And it's not lost on them that with the shortage of physicians and nurses, we're asking them to do a hell of a lot more than what they had to do in the past with a lot less. So with that said, we find that engaging them early brings them in, to Susan's point, as co-authors. Change is easier for any of us to accept when we feel like we've been part of the change-making process. So I don't just get it handed to me, it's not dictated to me, but I saw, to your statement, the why behind the change and the motive, and I was part of the solutioning. And that's where, the prototyping in particular that we do with mock-ups is extremely helpful, because they really have an opportunity to use their expertise, kind of working to the top of their license, and bring that to bear to create the next generation of builds. And that's where we have found great staff satisfaction post-occupancy. Obviously, depending on where you're starting from, if your baseline is an antiquated facility and you bring on something beautiful and new, we have seen that 40%, skyrocket as far as user satisfaction. I would say more on average, if you have contemporary facilities that are being added to or advanced, it's usually more in the, what I would say, 6 to 15% increment. It depends where your baseline started. That becomes really important, though, in healthcare, because you may be aware that with value-based purchasing, they are incentivized by CMS, which really governs over Medicare and Medicaid, patient satisfaction scores that are measured through surveys after their inpatient episode. And so depending on the results of that, there's 3 questions that are directly focused on the environment of care. You really want to make certain that you're doing everything you can to enable that provider that is delivering healthcare services maximize their full reimbursement that they're entitled to when delivering either Medicare or Medicaid services. So that's another kind of financial trigger for them, is those scores become incredibly important. The other thing that we monitor pretty closely is during the build cycle. So during construction, if we're disrupting a campus, we want to make sure we know what the baseline was as far as satisfaction scores, and we monitor them zealotly throughout the construction, because what we don't want is a fall off. We don't want people to feel like they can no longer navigate safely on the campus to get to a destination for services. We also don't want ambulances going on diversion because it's too much of a headache to go to that healthcare campus, because all of that starts to disable the patient service revenue that really makes the business case work for the capital build. So it's all intertwined there. And so we've seen that there's a lot of stewardship you have to take with regard to just monitoring and always knowing and reacting proactively, anticipating what do I need to do to make sure that I'm, yes, increasing those staff satisfaction scores, both post-occupancy and during the build. And then same thing with patient satisfaction scores, which again, most patients, when they're evaluating their care, none of us are clinically trained so that we don't measure efficacy of our care. But what do we measure? Was it clean? Could I navigate easily? Did I have good wayfinding? Those are the types of cues that become really important for our design community to lean in on and understand how to translate those into the solution real time. And human-centered care delivery, I think, really promotes that because it sensitizes everybody with that empathy right from the get-go.
That reminds me what you were saying, that when people are evaluating, they're going with what they know. They're not clinically trained. It's similar to in my line of work in communications and broadcasting. People can tell you, I don't watch that news program because I don't like it. And they can maybe kind of tell you why, but they don't know what's going on to get there. And so it's that translating from behind the scenes, from inside the industry to something patients can give you real truth feedback on, because you couldn't say, in the case of news, you couldn't say when that anchor is looking to do this in the A block, they'd be like, what are you talking about? And I imagine it's probably similar.
Susan hit on that earlier too, that I just wanted to kind of bring that to bear again, is she talked about showing imagery. And I think that's so important here because you may use a word as a descriptor and I may use a word as a descriptor. What I'm seeing when I say that word and what you're seeing may be vastly different, right? So trying to get concrete with some imagery to extract feedback, I think is really critical because it starts to pay respect to your audience and it allows them to join you in the conversation and clearly articulate the response to that image as opposed to worrying about the connotation of words.
Absolutely. With students, I think it's especially enlightening to show them images. We can show them images of dorm rooms or the amenity rooms where they're all socializing and having parties, or the kind of the study lounges. And what we may think is a very cool architectural design, they may feel really different about it. Interesting. I think students are looking for a home away from home, and they are eager to see something of that comfort at home. And everyone's home is different. Some students have 4 generations, right? So I think it's very interesting. So we can't build mock-ups of all of our rooms. We are not a hospital, and I did a lot of healthcare work, and we built mock-ups of surgery suites and nurses' stations, and it's super critical. So we look and look and look and find images that are close to what we're proposing. Then we'll put up 3 or 4 of them and talk to people about how the images make them feel. What's welcoming? If you had a choice, what room would you be in to study? If you had a choice, where would you like your team to have a meeting, etc.? And we call them precedent images, and they're great. We use them all the time. Huge folders on our network back in our office.
You both hit on this a little bit differently, but Michael McGee called that an ideograph, where if I say dog, I picture my dog, you probably picture yours. And so having those images, as you were talking about, Susan, that's a really important thing, especially because if you're talking to students, they're going to ask. Thanks for joining us on that little side quest into the world of design justice, user satisfaction, and why context matters just as much as concrete. If you haven't caught the full Need a Chicken, Got a Chicken, Why Human-Centered Design is More Complex Than It Looks episode yet, you're gonna want to do that. It's where the chicken joke started, so you won't think we're all just daft. It's also where this conversation really takes shape. You can also explore DBIA's Design Build Done Right resources, including our Design Excellence Position Statement at store.dbia.org. As always, the Design Build Delivers podcast is brought to you by ARKANCE. Learn more at arkanc.us/DBIA.